folks, Mike McDonald here for FSUFO with Chris Stiles, and today we've got a really interesting show lined up for y'all. We've got Steve MacLean hanging in the green room there, and Steve is going to tell us some pretty wild stories today, right, Chris?
He certainly is. Steve has been a friend of mine for decades now, and he's been in this pretty much as long as I have. His role is a little different than mine, but he's going to give us stories today that I think are second to none in terms of showing just how they're a little bit more flavorful and different in that part of Nova Scotia. And I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Yeah, well, let's bring Steve on.
Hello, Steve.
Hello,
Hi,
Chris.
Steve.
How are you?
Good to see you. Looks like
Hello,
a good
Steve.
sunny day down there in Pictou County. That doesn't help the UFO situation, but you never know. Motherships
never
do
know.
one of these years down here, and there's certainly been landing cases. So, listen, Steve, I'd like you to explain to our listeners, our followers here first, um, just how you got into this area. I know you've resisted the label of ufologist, but you've certainly been a chronicler and a collector of UFO stories. But I'd like you to explain to them why that fell to be your lot, like what your work was at the time, what put you in this situation that allowed you access to these great stories.
Well, like most people, I was always interested in UFOs from an early age. Always watched television, always bought the books and that sort of thing. But later in life, around when I was about 30 years old, I worked for a uniform rental company, and I did sales for them and deliveries. And of course, I found myself out in the county weekly, daily, meeting people, doing what I love best, just talking to people, and basically, sharing and listening to stories like a good maritimer. And somewhere along there, around 1996 in March, there was a mini flap here in Pictou County, originated, say, out of Pictou. And at that point, when I was doing the sales, of course, everyone was talking about it, and I would talk to people, and they would tell me their stories and their version of this event in '96. And eventually, I realized that I could be a part of the UFO experience by just talking to people and asking their stories and their encounters. And that was a revelation to me. That was very exciting, that I could. That people were a part of the UFO story right here in Pictou County. And as that went on, I realized that it was also all over Nova Scotia. And I came to meet people like yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that aspect of it never went away from me, and I still have it to this day. The just hearing an honest and good grassroots story from someone. So, and that's what has occurred throughout the years, just collecting stories and listening to people, relate their experience. And
Well, we're here today to listen to you. And the thing is, um, why don't we start in that mini flap here? Maybe you can give a good example, first off, just to see of the kinds of stories, the kind of cases that were presenting themselves to you on this route. And I know you have so many, I'm starting to wonder, service might have been poor. It must have slowed you down on the route. But why don't you jump in and give us a typical example from that flap year?
well, I was good at managing my time, but we'll say that. That was late March of '96, and someone had phoned into the local RCMP. They'd seen lights on the western horizon and thought they were UFOs. And coincidentally, a number of people phoned in at the same time. As it turns out, I think it was probably conventional objects, celestial objects, um, in the form of stars setting on the western sky that night. So as a mini flap, there was almost a little bit of hysteria. You know that term, Chris. So people get excited and maybe they exaggerate. And I think I learned a lot in that. One of the main things was everyone had a different impression of what happened. There's so many
Mm-hmm.
stories, so you definitely learn that and keep that close as the years go on. That interpretation is something else.
Well, it's often said that sightings breed sightings, and I think that works in both senses of that. I mean, when there is a sighting that stands out and has corroboration and is impressive in the media, then everybody starts looking up, waiting for that clear sky, waiting for that chance to catch a glimpse. But at the
Absolutely.
same time, it can create a hysteria too, where people expect it and they start connecting the dots and putting in dotted lines. Like, so that one, like you're saying, that made you start considering it. But maybe next you could give us a good example of one where, it's not so easily explained away and probably unlikely to be attributed to, an astronomical event or misinterpretation. Uh, well, let me put it this way: what was the first really, and I love this word, kooky one? And I know you have some kooky stories, and we're going to save some for the end here that I really love. But why don't you give us
Um,
one where it most likely was something unconventional here?
Hopefully, I can oblige. Just to continue with that first theme, when I
Mm.
was getting those stories, I was getting stories about the mini flat, but people would say, I didn't see that event, but I can tell you about another one, and that's
Ah.
what happened. That's fascinating. Like and it's just coming and coming and coming. There's a high rate of sightings coming in. Um, on the kooky department, as opposed to seeing something, a light in the sky or a saucer. One sighting involved two gentlemen in mid-December on a nice overcast day with fog over the in their setting, and they were hunting rabbits. So they're walking through broken fields with a little bit of spruce trees, looking for rabbits, and you got to have a cigarette when you're smoking in the Maritimes hunting rabbits. So they stopped and lit up a cigarette, and somewhere far, far off in the distance, they could hear a loud sound like a motor. And they described it as a dynamo. And gentleman had worked in a ship before. He described it like that, like something that loud and almost shaking the ground. But as they sat there having the cigarettes, and they both had a 22, and you had to remember that the fog came from the ground up. At the top of the spruce trees was fog up into it. There was no ceiling, right? It was all foggy and a very warm day, and so they
Hmm.
couldn't see anything but just hear.
But they became quite fearful, if I remember, if I got the right story.
Yep. So that was a couple of minutes like that where they could hear something far away. But as they walked through the woods a little bit, around the spruce trees, it came closer to them, and it got louder and louder. And eventually, they had the perception that it was right above them, even though they couldn't see it. Now you have to imagine 10 to 15-foot high spruce trees with fog above it, and they couldn't see a thing. But yet there was something just above them in that fog, that white fog, that was almost rattling the teeth out of their skulls.
Hmm.
So very,
Yeah.
very profound. And so eventually it scared them, and they said, "Well, we're getting out of here." They threw the cigarettes away and ran as fast as they could to their car, jumped over a fence, and jumped into the car and sped to town. Of course, no one
Hmm.
ever believed them. So call it
Well,
an
yeah,
anomalous event. Yeah, that
yeah,
was kooky.
yeah. It
Those things.
is, and one of the things that I've noticed with cases down that way is you get, I would say, a higher percentage of ones where a UFO isn't actually seen, but it's heavily inferred by the details, whether it's like a loud noise or a perception or a hysteria or whatever.
Or a trace. Or I have one story in the area of Glengarry in Pictou County, in the outskirts of town, in which a gentleman, he has a farm, and he was in his farmhouse, and one morning he'd get up and he could hear the cows making a racket up in one of the upper fields up a little hill. And of course, as soon as he heard that, he realized that something was up with the clouds, or with the cows, and he proceeded to go up and investigate it, and he found on the top of the hillside his herd of cattle, about 30 cattle, standing close and around a 60-foot black circle in the hay, or in the hayfield rather. And as he described it, it was as if you'd taken a blowtorch and scorched it right down to the earth. It even scorched
Wow.
the goldenrod.
Yeah. Well,
It
what year would
scorched the
this have
what
been?
out? I'm sorry, I missed that. What did it scorch out?
The goldenrod is that, that tall
Oh,
weed, the yellow
goldenrod.
weed.
Ah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's scorched
Any
that
idea what
great
the
photograph.
yeah? Any idea what the diameter of this circle would have been, Steve? Or
We often laugh at this, but I swear to God, he said 60 foot. It's always 60 feet.
that number comes up quite a bit in cases.
It
Michael's a
does,
grin. You
yeah.
know what I'm thinking, but really, in many that figure, 60 feet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
convenient size
something
for
beyond a
intergalactic
sport
travel.
model, but not the mothership. I think of it as.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so the cattle were there pawing at the ground and passing manure, and that's a bit of a tell.
Hey,
They
there's an image, eh? Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
he got 30 cows, pretty upset about something in the field, and that to him indicated that something real had occurred. Um, Interesting sighting, great sighting. Um, yeah, but again, nothing was seen, but implied that, of course, they said, well, a spaceship landed and scorched a perfectly round circle. Now, it could have been a fire, but that area experienced a couple of UFOs over the years. There was another one past that. A couple of years past that, the same gentleman had contacted me, and he saw a large orange orb, say the size of here we go again, a small car, across the valley from him on his neighbor's property.
Hmm.
Large orange globe, and it was in one of his fields, close to the house, say about 200 feet from the house. Now, when I went out to investigate it, we did talk to the neighbor, and he said he didn't hear anything unusual that night. And further pressing, he said, you know what? My dog, who was very old and didn't get up for anything, took a fit that night, got up and barked and barked and barked at the door. He investigated, looked out, and couldn't see anything. But we determined that it was the exact same night that his other neighbor across the valley had seen the orange globe. And we checked. I took a lot of pictures for that one, investigated it, and there was no marks, of course, on the
Hmm.
grass for that one. So
You
that's
know,
an interesting one where you have
yeah,
animal reaction. I'm going to plug this phone in. Is that okay if I move a bit?
yeah. You're getting some
Yeah, go
crackle
right
there.
ahead. Yeah, you might want to also just back away from the table a little bit. We're just getting a little bit of clickety clackety.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not touching it at all. It's
You're
fine.
not touching. Okay, then it's a
Promise. Yeah.
connection thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Um. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's an
So
interesting. That's an interesting
Steve,
area out in Glengarry. See, I'm not.
yeah,
I'm not
Steve.
touching. Anyway,
What year were you down the valley doing the library science thing there? I'll tell you why I ask.
it was
What year would that have
98
been?
to 2000, 98, 99, and 2000.
Okay, in those years, I had a couple cases in Guysborough County, not all that far from down that end of the province, right? And
Yep.
they were two different, and one of them they came up quite differently. One of them was near Smithville in Guysborough County, and that UFO case became an IFO. There was this great circle, but it turned out to be a very unusual fungus ring. And it looked very impressive when you seen it. It was a perfect circle. It was about 60 feet again across. And
Mhm.
it turned out I had it analyzed. It was a very specific fungus and a very rare one. And it looked the reverse of what you usually see in these. And it made it very convincing. But, that one was solved. But the other one that I seen was similar to your story about the cows. It was burned into the soil and there was no reasonable explanation for it. And it was just beyond Smithville. And it always stuck with me, because generally I've not been impressed with like, crop circles and these things, not that some of them may be legitimate, but just that it's the kind of evidence that can be fake. But in this case, it was impressive and burnt in and just meticulous. So I
Yeah.
was wondering, so you would have missed those ones, of course, but there was probably
Yeah, that
some
is correct.
therefore also in Pictou County. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
so we,
So,
we have a precedent of sort of pseudo crop circles in Canada. Actually, that's an interesting point. Is that why are all the crop circles in Wiltshire, England, and why are there so
well, they're
few
not.
in this huge, vast territory of ours?
Yeah. But they're not some of the earliest ones before it became such a flap of them, such a rage, such a in Britain, what was it? Edwin, what was the name? Steve Fure, I think, out in the prairies in Saskatchewan in the 70s was a Canadian case,
Hmm.
and He's seen several circles laid down at once, supposedly, and it was kind of a big, scary, whirring sound and that. And there were cases of that up north back then in the 70s and 60s, Michael,
Mm-hmm.
that
But
I'd found
in
one
all
of.
the pictures I've seen of Canadian crop circles, they're always a very poor imitation of these elaborate circles of in that part
None
of
of
England.
none of the Canadian cases are these elaborate artistic things that some people think are a message, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah. But anyway, Steve. Okay, let's
Claims.
move along here. There's another case I really want to ask you about because I know you've got up close and personal, looked into some cases that really stand out. And I don't even know what you call this one or where it was and when. And I'd like you to try to give us even a rough estimate of that. But like the one that I always think of is, and this is going to be neat, and this is one of the things I like that Bali does. Instead of just saying a case is, has some fonding system, he tends to give name like the copper medic or whatever. And the one that I remember I like to get in is what I call the anti-gravity hallway, and that'll probably tell you which one it is. And I'd like you to try to tell us that story because that is unique.
And this is an example of when you spend time at this, the synchronicity that comes forward, how you link up cases, and would indicate that it's true. Um, oh, so there's so many people I talked to. So I was speaking to one woman who thought she was seeing UFOs flying around the pulp and paper plant in Pictou County here, which may be seagulls, which is a common misidentified, if you can believe it. Seagulls from a long distance can look disc-like and white. So in that conversation, I of course always ask people, have you ever experienced anything else, or do you know of any other stories? And you always get something, of course. So I asked her that, and she said, well, when she was growing up in the rural area of Pictou County, I think it was out in Telford, she was at home with her siblings. I think there was four of them all together. She was somewhere around the middle child, and there was an older babysitter, and the parents were away, and they were in a big old farmhouse. And at some point during that evening, the boy, her younger brother, discovered that he could float around in the hallway.
Wow.
There was a small anti-gravity pool, and they all jumped in it, through it, and floated for a while. I forget just how long, at least an hour. And the babysitter was quite upset, and it eventually disappeared. Now, about a year later, I'm talking to another person who claimed to have been abducted in the same area close to this. And she said she could remember the older brother coming to school the next day or two and talking about an anti-gravity area in the farmhouse. She could remember that. So stuff like that, you just love it when those connections like that happen.
Mm,
And
mm.
everyone involved believed it. And now the house is torn down, so I couldn't. I didn't get down to it to investigate it. But who knows? Maybe as we speak, there could be a small pocket of anti-gravity on an abandoned farm field in Telford in Pictou County. Um,
Wow.
Hmm.
Yeah,
You know,
neat. Yeah, it's wonderful how you can connect stories up like that. It's chilling, and you get what I always call that sense of wonderment. Um, to imagine for this person 30 years later to say, yeah, I remember when the members of the family came to school and recounted that story. And as you know, Chris, this business is littered with incidences of that where things link up like that.
well, one of the things, is, if you were going to make up a story, if you were just going to
Mhm.
tell a tale and somehow that was going to, fill your life with what I would call, I don't know, a life substitute, when that happens, you kind of wouldn't pick the details that present in these stories. Uh, the anti gravity thing is just so unique, and I'm not sure, what that even implies. You could
Yeah,
speculate. It would be fun. It would tell us little. But when you mentioned the sighting of the gentleman that on his property had the circle and the cows reacting to it and that, his other sighting of the orange orb, which by the way is one of the most common things reported in Nova Scotia and on the East Coast, you
yeah,
typically don't wouldn't see these as the kind of things to report. If you're going to make up a story, you'd probably make it a little more lively, give it a little more juice, as the kids say, you know. But I
Mhm.
don't find that, you know. The other thing that I find, and is to me is often an indicator of a story, that if it can't be reinvestigated as a cold case, it does give some indication to me. Is the fact that these when you get these stories where, you know, they're rather tame and mild in details, like, say, I saw an orange sphere across the field, and yet you see these people have such a strong emotional reaction to them, or even a psychological scar that lingers for years, you know, or, you know, these kind of things. These are a strong indicator that somehow the person just knew. And you'll see this even in children, you know, that you know, sometimes, you know, they just infer things. But, you know, at the same time, you you can't go too far with this. I'll tell you one quick little cute story, and I think I've told you this one before. And Mike, you're going to like this. I was down in Cape Breton once to look at some UFO video that somebody shot of an object coming across the strait, you know, in the Port Hawkesbury area. And when I got down there, the house was up on a hill. It was a fantastic property, and there was a long wood road going up. And at the bottom, there was a little 4-year-old guy playing with plastic dinosaurs in a mud puddle. And he jumps right up when he sees me, and the woman up on the hill waves to come up, and he starts walking up the hill with me. And the little toddler looks up and says, "You know, I know why you're here." And I said, "Why is that?" He says, "My mom shot video of a UFO." I said, "Oh, did you? And did she?" And he says, "Oh, yes, she did." I said, "How do you know it was a UFO?" He said, "Man, it didn't even have a door." When I got up and I saw the video, it was obviously a large black garbage bag that had been filled with helium or whatever, that was tumbling gently across the strait, you know. But still, it shows how that, you know, somebody that, you know, people say, well, you should be careful, don't contaminate your witness. But even this 4-year-old had preconceptions of what made a UFO a UFO. So, you know,
Interesting. There's also
yeah.
the possibility of collective conscious. Steve, have you ever heard of the story of the spook farm of Caledonia Mills?
Oh, yeah.
Sure have. I was close to the site. A lot of logging's gone on there now, so it's hard to find the exact site without having someone, direct you to it, having a guide. But I did go down to the area on one occasion and try to find it. Came close, didn't get right to it. I
Hmm.
will say there was a lot of bears in the area at that time during blueberry time. So watch out for bears if you go down.
Right. Well, just for
Fascinating.
the audience's benefit, the basic story. It's a complicated story, and they even had a researcher come in from New York. There was a policeman involved. It was a series of
Peachy.
paranormal events. Paranormal
Peachy
events.
Carroll.
Peachy
Peachy
Carroll.
Carroll.
That's right. And then there was a newspaper from the Herald, the reporter. But at any rate, what happened was is that it started with things being rearranged on the farm, like for example, the farmer McDonald, he would go out into the yard, and all the things from the barn would be all spread out very neatly in the yard, and then eventually there were cattle and animals being loosed in the barn, and then the really strange thing is the braided tails of creatures, and then of these spook fires, as they call them, that would actually look like burning curtains, and you douse them out, and there'd be no charring, there'd be no actual evidence of burning. And of course, it all centered around the possibility that the young girl, the adopted girl, who was at that time going through puberty, was somehow behind it, either physically or potentially through some sort of energy or a focal point for high strangeness. They never did solve that story, but it did end, as I recall, with the Herald reporter. I wish I could remember his name. Um, Doing an automatic writing session, spontaneous, when they were staying in the house. And of course, at this point, the McDonalds were not living in the house; it was the dead of winter, and apparently the what was written was given to the bishop of the local Catholic Church, and he threw it into the fire. Nobody knows what the
Yes.
automatic writing said. I think I have that more or less right, Steve.
Yep. Yep.
It's quite a
Yeah,
story. Yeah,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
should
it is
point
quite a
out
story.
that
One of
one
the
of our
best ones.
future guests did an investigation into the case, and I think they were actually on site there. Believe it or not, RCMP officer Elliot Van Dusen, who will be in a future episode, runs a group, the PPRI, and they investigate all things paranormal. And I think they did a lengthy on-site overnight camping thing at the site, Michael. So
Right, right. It was
we should,
Whidden. Whidden
in
was
that
the name of
episode,
the
we
reporter.
can go there. Yeah.
Yeah, Whidden was the name of the reporter, and the gentleman, the investigator who came from the Parapsychological Society of New York. I mean, this made headlines all across the world. This
Yeah.
story because it was released in the Herald and it went on for a whole winter. It kind of reminds me in a way of some of the stories you're talking about, Steve. I mean, that we're not talking classic UFO stories. We're talking about high strangeness, huh, Chris?
Yeah, yeah, and there's a number of I mean, another one would be what was that called? The Great Amherst Mystery, or in the
Yeah,
town of
yeah,
Amherst? Yeah, that was another one that even attracted, the attention of people like the U.S. president at the time. These were world famous cases here from Nova Scotia. Of maybe not of UFOs, but certainly of the paranormal. But I mean, we've seen that, Michael, haven't we, in Southwest Nova, where you'll have spiritual cases, sea monster cases in areas near places and near times of UFO incidents. It seems to bring these things to the surface and seems to egg them on. So, Steve, to get back to you, since this is your show and it's about you, let's go right to the meat and potatoes here and say, have you ever had any claims of UFO encounters or abduction scenarios, this kind of thing? The up close, personal, dramatic type down in Pictou County or the east end of Nova Scotia.
First one I encountered took place. I investigated it when I was going to school back in the '90s, and it was down in the valley. And I can't remember how I contacted the person or she contacted me, and she told a long tale of lifelong abduction. Classic that
A
you would
repeater.
read. A repeater, absolutely, like from childhood. You know, prior to age 5, seeing entities in the closet, in the bedroom. Having imaginary friends and seeing them when she was growing up. Seeing things in the woods, having owls and deer, stare at her when she's playing in the woods and that sort of thing. And she was married, coincidentally, to a spy who was with NATO, and they eventually got divorced. And this will another sort of common trait. She didn't remarry, but she got a boyfriend later in life, and he was also a repeater, abductee, and so they would spend time at their cottage down in the valley, and she just would describe how she knew when the aliens were coming. She could hear a sound. It wasn't within, it wasn't without, it was, oh, Chris, help me that one. Yeah, it was from within. It was like between the tick and the talk, she could hear something, and she would
Yeah.
know that night they were coming for her.
I,
It wasn't a
I, I,
sound, but it was infrasound, not infrasound, but interdimensional, maybe we could say. Um, but they would come, and she'd be lying in bed, and she would become paralyzed, and she couldn't wake up her partner, and she would see lights on coming up the hallway on the ceiling and into the bedroom,
mm,
and they would take her up, and she would melt through the wall. Typical, suspension of physical
mm.
reality that you hear so much with alien encounters, as varied
Well,
as they are. So
the,
so
the,
varied.
the
But
yeah, these are the common things reported. I'm going to wind back, though, to
yep,
one of the things I find interesting that you mentioned in this case in the Valley. So this is when you were back in your course for library science, is it?
correct. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I talked to her a number
Okay.
of times,
Yeah.
and it gets
Well,
better.
I'll tell you what jumps out at me here. One of the details is you mentioned sightings of deer as a child, or uh, you mean just being close or inordinate amounts of them,
Close.
or
And the eyes, she would look out
yeah.
at night and see a deer in the backyard, and the eyes, she would claim the eyes are bigger, blacker, deeper, and hypnotic. And the same with, I
Well,
believe she said owls too. Um,
okay.
and
So
then,
what I
and
have to
that's part of
consider,
the,
yeah. Well, what this makes me
butt
think of
hauls.
here is back when Dark Object was released, the book about Shag Harbor that I co-wrote with Don Ledger. That book, the editor of that was Whitley Strieber, and Whitley has been a big proponent of claiming that often in these cases you run into what he calls screen memories that cover up the true remembrance, or at least the full ability to recall
Yeah.
the true details of the encounters.
Yeah.
And one of the things Whitley suggests that's often reported, particularly in these rural things, is deer, the sightings of deer in unexpected places. You go into your backyard and there's 16 deer there, and the eyes seem big and large. And he claimed that
Yeah.
often in rural sightings that this is a screen memory that's erected to help, just hold back the truth of the encounter, right? And I've seen this a lot in these cases where children, women, anybody, even
Yeah.
currently I'm hearing of a male case like that of a middle-aged gentleman there down near Liverpool that is experiencing that same detail. So interesting.
Yeah. I went on to speak to her spouse. She readily gave contact information, and I phoned him up, and it was, I'll never forget, it was absolutely chilling and heart-rending. I had a long talk with him in which he broke down and cried. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, where, just trying to describe being abducted and seeing aliens. It's chilling, to say the
Mm-hmm.
least. That was a while ago. I tried to reestablish contact with her, but I, I, that was a while ago. She may have passed away by now, a long time ago. The other abduction case was last year, so fairly recent, a really nice one. And this was a person who was about 5 or 6 years old. They were in their yard, close by. Oh yeah, I mentioned earlier, over in the Telford area, and she was in her yard on the swing. Nice sunny day. Her father was working on the car in the yard, and all of a sudden, time stopped, sound stopped, the birds stopped, everything stopped except for her, and she couldn't figure out what it was. She looked to her right and to the right of their house. There appeared to be a spaceship of some sort, but um, the thing is, and I've heard it before, as she approached it, it's like the underwater effect. The air it's like I can't even describe. She's like going into a melted area of air. The color changes, the air changes, sound changes, and she was standing under a disc, and then she can't remember anything after that. She has classic missing time, and the next thing she remembers, she's running around the side of the house, and her father is still working on the car, and she says, "Did you see that?" And he put her off the way parents do, and said, "No, there was nothing there." And now the funny
Mm.
part is that evening when she went to bed, she had predominant bruises on the back of her hands and on the tops of her feet, and all she can remember all these years later is getting what she calls a download of ones and zeros most of the night when she tried to sleep. 1 0 1 1 0
Well, that
over and over and
I've
over
heard
again.
that story before. Not that story, but I've heard that phenomenon before.
The
Yeah,
download,
Michael,
yes.
that's often a proponent that's been explained and brought forward by Grant Cameron, the
Mm-hmm.
Canadian researcher. When
Mm-hmm.
I was up in Toronto at the MUFON conference in 2018, our sellers table in the hallway, Grant was sitting right next to me, right? And that's one of the things I've heard him, you know, hearing stories from people. And that's a great thing, just like you,
Yeah.
Steve. I wish that would have been a good one. People often sit when they're doing their sales in the hallway, and that's when you get stories. But I can remember him
Mm-hmm.
explaining that, and you'd brought that up to me recently too, that that is something that he
Chilling,
has
yeah.
put out as a common feature, right?
Yes. And this witness, they claim, they had no prior knowledge of Graham or reading or abduction stuff. Um, yeah. So, it kind of closes that loop, and they and it was just, gives you the chilly bumps, as they say, when they
Mm-hmm.
have a tell like that, or,
Mm-hmm.
getting the download.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's why
There's
it's
a
so
grand
important
case.
why it's so important that for people who are interviewing UFO witnesses or abduction experiencers to keep their trap shut and try not to lead on the interviewee.
Oh,
Don't
yeah. I'm
contaminate your
so
witness.
cautious, so
Mm-hmm.
cautious. I'll reiterate. Be as gentle as possible. Say, you can't
Mhm.
say it enough. I don't want to lead. I don't want to suggest. And yeah, every time. I'm currently talking to another person that may or may not have have experienced
Mm.
abductions along with the family. Then you get that multiple generational effect, and it's not quite there, but keeping an open mind, of course, it's fascinating for sure.
Some of these cases have been reported to the RCMP, and they're in the collection records group 77. There's a case, I can't remember the family name. I don't know if you'll remember it, Steve, but down, it was a little farther afoot from Pictou, but near in the Spring Hill area, somebody back in the 60s was driving to Hamilton, Ontario at night. And when they were passing through the area, they believed they saw six literally flying saucers nearby in a field, and they were scared and they just picked up the pace and went. When they arrived in Hamilton, Ontario, when they started to discuss it, and they didn't until then, they believed there was missing time. And they actually went in and reported this to the RCMP, and they did a lengthy investigation into it and wrote it out. I actually don't have that document, but I know it is within Records Group 77. You know, I should go back and try and get that someday. I don't know how
Just to
many times
clarify,
in the world
Chris,
that
Records Group 77, can you just, what is that?
yeah, that's a collection that's available to the public that's held by Library and Archives Canada, as they're now called in their last rebranding. It's
Mm-hmm.
a group of UFO sightings that I'm trying to remember the actual name of the collection. There's 4 rolls of old 8 millimeter small microfilm, right? And they deal with sightings that span from, I believe, the early 60s right up to like 81, 80, actually close to 1990.
Who
And this
collates these?
collection,
Where do these come from, this collection?
oh boy,
Agencies,
we can get into
police
that.
agents,
It's a hodge, yeah, it's a hodgepodge. It's
Police? Yeah,
police
it's a
sightings.
hodgepodge. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
hodgepodge.
police sightings. It's people that have reported them directly to the air desk in the past, right? The air desk being the division of the Royal Canadian Air Force that was charged with, investigating UFO cases. It's all these things, and it ends up in a big bin. Strange. What's really odd, and what I tried to solve when I was in Ottawa, and I actually went up there to go through the actual textual documents, right, in 1994 on a grant. And it was very frustrating because when I talked to the people that did this, the policy as to what was kept and what was excluded and what was shredded was very troubling. Some of the people in the access building told me they estimated that up to 85% of these reports are shredded. And there was no clear policy as to why some were preserved and some weren't. And here's the part: if those numbers are accurate, somebody there, and I'd love to know what the policy was, preserved, I'd say 20% of it was the ramblings of one schizophrenic who used to send them in from the US, who had all this bizarre abbreviations and explanations, and it would go on for pages. And it was, I think, quite safely and obviously just a hallucination. And yet all that was preserved. I could name the gentleman. I remember there was so much of it, and they would send a thank you letter from the air desk to him, and he just kept sending this stuff. But at the same time, when I was, one time I was getting a file there, Stephen. I think you might remember this story because it was such an exciting time for me in those early days to go to Ottawa, and there was a lot of miscommunication. And one day I had a group of files that had formerly been secret, part of Records Group 24, which is a pure military group. And before they allowed me access, they said, we're going to have to ship them across the street to the access building and have them reviewed. And me being the kind of troublemaker I was, I ran across the street uninvited, went in, went up and said I wanted to see the guy that was reviewing them. And I met him and he shook my hand. He said, well, I was going to have lunch, but I'll do it right now. I said, well, let's go down, buy yourself a lunch and get me one. And we were in a hallway, and I literally sat around the corner from him about 6 feet away while he was doing the review and tried to ask him. And I could hear that he was setting, there was 2 different piles, and he had to decide what I was allowed access to and what I wasn't. And, he said, don't quote me on this or use a name, but he said, I'd estimate that 85% of these are shredded. And there was no clear policy or guideline. Very disturbing. Yeah. But, you see cases like I said, the one in Spring Hill that made it. And of course, In the amongst that collection that you can borrow through the interlibrary loaner system, there's perhaps 12 documents about, say, the Shag Harbor incident, and many about the Stefan Mahalik case, Falcon Bay, Manitoba, which is Canada's largest single UFO file by volume, right?
Falcon Lake, yeah.
Falcon Lake, absolutely not Shag Harbor. And the reason is there was so much shenanigans, and maybe we'll get into that when we do our CMP cases in a future episode. But they took one of the witness, well, the sole witness, and got him drunk and tried to get him to recant, and lots of shenanigans. Produced a lot of paperwork. The Mounties don't do much without producing a trail of paperwork, let me tell you.
I have a
So,
question
Steve,
for Steve. Steve, do you think that Nova Scotia is particular when it comes to the frequency and the types of high strangeness? Because I don't want to just say UFOs, but do you think that it's a special area compared to other parts of the country, or is it simply because we are based in Nova Scotia and you're based in Nova Scotia that we get more of this information in this little group of ours?
I would say the later, yeah. It's my belief that these encounters of paranormal events, there's probably just as many here in Pictou County as the next county, and the next county over, and the next province. It could be ubiquitous. It's across the country, across North America, Europe. There seems to be more in the civilized end of the world. You often get that argument. There's not that much reported through Africa, but I don't think. I think it's everywhere, and it's like we were saying earlier, because we're looking at it, we're seeing and hearing more of it. As in when there's a flap, you're getting more reports because we're listening and watching. More people are doing that. So I think it's everywhere. And it just comes to certain people, whatever this phenomena is. Some people are just lucky or unfortunate and see and hear it more than others, and I think it's. I'm looking out the window. Yeah, it's everywhere. It's part of our existence, I believe.
does it affect people's daily life there, Steve?
Um, I don't think so. No. Like I say, it's been a
Let me
while
give you an
since I've been out.
example of what I mean, what I run into down in, Shelburne County and Queens County and Yarmouth, the other end. I'll tell you
Yeah,
what I
it's not
mean.
the same.
I think you're familiar with the Smith brothers case. I'm not going to rehash that. But there's a
Yeah.
case where these men were so traumatized by a UFO sighting they had that for the rest of their lives, they drove an extra 6 kilometers a day to going on
Mhm.
across a certain spot on Highway 3. It was just too traumatic, the memory. That's an alter.
Yeah.
Another alteration would be when I did a clipboard survey once in the early 90s. I was going door to door in Cape Sable Island. And when I did that, people would come to the door and ask me if they'd seen a UFO, explain who I was. And they were quite polite. And once I said UFO, someone would say, "Oh, I'm sick of hearing about that. Everybody thinks they're seeing something. I don't know anything. I never seen any UFOs. All I knew when I was growing up, my mother said, when you see the orange balls on the beach, stay away from them. Don't go near them." And I tell our kids the same. And boy, when I see them, I keep the
Yeah.
kids away. It was part of everyday
Yeah. It
life. It was
definitely.
just rolled in. Anything like
Yeah,
that in
down there,
Pictou
I
or
would
your
say.
way?
No, not as prevalent. No, I can
Yeah.
easily say
So
it's
it's
not the same as what you just described.
like I said at the start, they
Um,
have a different flavor down your way. You know?
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Industry based, a lot of working class and stuff like that. And does that have anything to do with it? I'm not sure. I don't know. I just know that if you spend time outside talking to people, everybody's got a story, quote unquote. They're
Speaking of
not all
that,
high.
as we get closer to the end of the show, I wouldn't mind pulling a couple more stories out of your brain there, Steve. Have you got a couple more in the queue there?
Under the odd category, I seem to have a lot of stories of an anomalous lights when people are sleeping or sitting in their room, in the dark or alone. One gentleman told me he was sitting in his room and the lights were off. He had laid down and a shaft of light about the size of a pen dropped out of the ceiling, and it was a dark blue light. And as he watched it, trying to figure out what it was, total amazement, it slowly grew to about the size of a basketball, still blue. and just exploded into like a camera flash went off, like a kaboom, and no explanation, no rhyme or reason, no follow up. I've never seen a light before, during, or after, and that's just it. And you're just stuck with that experience with absolutely no experience, no explanation ever again. And talk to a lot of people, that, as you're saying, Chris, has changed their life. Yeah, people have no explanation for that sort of thing. Just definitely change their outlook for sure. Um, Other experience. Head back to the Glengarry area. Talk about kooky, and it makes you wonder if it's just connection to spurious stories or not. But there was sort of a prominent story of a dog man sighting out there. If you want to take a left turn, a dog man is like 6-7 foot high, basically a werewolf. But he's not wearing dungarees as he's often depicted. Um, I investigated that story, let's say, extensively, and found nothing to it. But I think because it was in the Glengarry area, it had a special attraction for me. Um, Odd stories. Yeah, the lights at night. Talk to people that have, lights come through a window from nowhere. They're sleeping, come through the bedroom light, size of a pencil, and will disappear. That sort of thing. Lots of lights. Another person seeing orbs floating. They'd be lying in bed, and the orbs would float up the hallway. They can see light in the hallway, and they'll float into the bedroom, and then explode again, or just disappear. Um, there's lots of that, lots of anomalous lights.
So
Well,
little
Steve,
incidents that happen, yeah, little
yeah.
incidents that may not be a grand
Yeah,
story, but you add them all up together, you can see a trend on the go here.
as I say, I think it's everywhere.
Yeah.
There's everyone. If you believe that everyone has a story, you give them the time. Of course, you can't look into them all. The stories are fleeting. Um,
Mhm.
but sometimes you get good ones, and you research them and follow through. For instance, there's a story I've been following for 2 years here in the Salt Springs area, Pictou County, where a person told me that a friend of a friend, was walking their dog in the afternoon, broad daylight, as we say, as opposed to daylight. I hate that. And he witnessed a classic silver spaceship over the road about the height of telephone poles, with a railing on the outside and portholes. And again, they were traumatized by it. And the quote is something like, it changed the outlook of their life entirely.
Mhm.
And I always love it when the dog notices it too. The dog acknowledged it, and
Dogs are
that's
great
about as much as
UFO detectors.
they are great detectors. And if you're sitting
Yeah.
alone at night in your living room and your cat looks at something, yeah, be
Yeah.
afraid. But that's a good example of 2 years and that one and running. The witnesses in the
Well,
States and couldn't get back home because of COVID. Um, but and it's not very often you get portholes and a railing around the
Papua
outside.
New
Yeah.
Guinea.
And
Papua New Guinea. Yeah. Father
yeah,
Gill, wasn't that the name? Papua New Guinea.
yeah,
Listen, Steve, I know a
yeah.
different kind of story you can tell, and it might make you slightly uncomfortable here. And I think of it, I put this one in the category of what, for a ufologist, of what I would call a cautionary tale. And I'd like you to tell the story about the night you were planning that we were all going to have a sky watch, and I was going to be there.
Oh,
Look at the grin coming, and unfortunately, things went sideways, and Steve ended up canceling. Maybe you could tell that story and what we all heard. Yeah. Here we go. There's the
well,
embarrassment.
as I get into UFOs, I used to have what's called the shower power meteorite parties. No, shower shower power meteorite shower party, something like that. And I would invite everybody I knew. Like I'd get 10 to 15 people, and invite them to come to a isolated location in the dark and turn off the lights. And it's just a wonderful experience having all these different people meet for the first time in the dark. And they invariably got along really well. And we would watch the meteorite shower, the Perseids meteorite shower in August, and that sort of thing. So this one evening or one year, we planned to have it here at my new house, and the plans fell through, and we didn't have the big party. We're all ready to go. It didn't happen. That night was one of the biggest bolide. I think it was a bolide, or meteor sighting over Nova Scotia. May have been the biggest since, you get a big
Yeah.
one, I don't know, 10, 20 years. But we missed it, and I have never not been able to live it down whenever meteor stories come up. I've
Yeah,
got
it
friends
wasn't
who said,
just that. Over the next few days, you had the case of in PEI, the landing case
and then
that
that
blended into
occurred
that.
too.
Oh,
Ebenezer.
yes.
Oh,
Ebenezer.
that now this story I would like to just explore for a couple
Oh,
of minutes because this is a
oh,
fascinating
yeah.
story. It involves men in black and unusual vehicles and
Well,
everything.
Uh,
maybe. Maybe.
Sea Sparrow missiles, agents with silver
Yeah.
Pontiac 6000s, I was told.
Well,
Set them
I
up,
could
Chris. Set them
explain
up
all
with the
that.
background, and then we'll fill in there, just so people, our folks out there, can
Well,
get a
well,
sense of
well,
what we're talking
Steve, I'll
about.
tell you what. We'll both put this one to bed. Here, you start. You set it up, and you explain the things that we're told.
Oh my
You
God.
just mentioned some of the details from the Peter Zowski coverage that was on CBC. Set it up and tell what people were saying, and I'll tell you about my investigation into the case.
Well, it was I was on the road, and Peter Zowski's morning show was on, and he had the reporter from PEI, and he said, "What's going on?" Did the roundup, and they said, "Well, there's a UFO sighting and over the entire province, and Ebenezer was the epicenter." And she really spun it as if, and it was a real event, Peter. Something happened, and he was intrigued, and I almost drove off the road and said, "Oh my God, gotta call Chris." And whatnot. And so someone had mentioned a name. I got a name anyway, and I wouldn't mention it. And I phoned one of the witnesses, and she picked up the phone. I said, "Hi, my name is Steve," and all this stuff, and with it. And I said, "Would you like to talk about it?" And she yelled into the phone at me. She said, "No, I wouldn't." And she slammed the phone down so hard she missed the cradle, picked it up and slammed it down again. I laugh. We kind of like those. It's dramatic to say the least. And then I had talked to the president of the Charlottetown Astronomical Club, I believe. Chris, you'll remember the name for me. And he poo-pooed it. He thought it was a celestial event. Again, a meteor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was about it. Over to you,
Okay, well,
Chris,
let's
on
just
that.
let's just we're dancing around the crux of the biscuit here, as Frank Zappa would say. What was seen in a field, a glowing
Oh, I'll tell you
triangle.
what was seen in the
Yeah.
field,
Oh,
and
it
and
wasn't cosmic
my
debris.
version comes from the Rescue Coordination Center reports. What was reported by the unnamed witnesses, and I could name them, and I just won't subject them to the torment because they've never cooperated and never wanted to be part of it. But their names are listed and available in an RCMP report. Not RCMP, RCC, the Rescue Coordination Center. And what they reported was that something landed in a field in Ebenezer, and I found that actual field years later when I reinvestigated the case. And they described it as an upside down ice cream cone with the wide end down, and that after it landed, it glowed for some hours, right? And they called the RCMP that were nearby. I forget which detachment. I think it was Charlottetown, though, actually, because or Cornwall, maybe Cornwall. So anyway, the RCMP responded, and the officers did report seeing it in a distance, but they could not locate the actual site and assumed that when they got there, the light had extinguished, right? That same night, there were also reports of metal debris crashing down in Cape Breton near French Vale. Okay. And all this was, going on and looked into. Um, the Peter
Very
Zowski show
prolific.
really kind of inflamed and blew this up and, told these stories of, Pontiac 6000s and Men in Black and,
Sparrow
weeks
missiles.
later, vehicles, you jump in anytime
A,
there, Steve, all this kind
a
of stuff,
caravan of
Sea
caravan of
Sparrow's
trucks that
missiles
showed up in the day or so afterwards.
Well, yeah, one of the
on the
early
North Shore.
Halifax,
Hmm.
yeah. Uh, Now, some of this is coincidence. You got to remember, these are one of these
Yes.
sightings. A lot of them happen, and they're naturally messy. And it's messy because, yes, the Perseids were happening, right? So you have to look at that. The one of the Halifax class destroyer escorts was off going through a shakedown in the Northumberland Strait and was firing Sea Sparrow missiles. So you have to look at that data, right? You were getting these calls and reports of something landing in a field in PEI and stuff crashing down near a campsite in French Bay, Cape Breton. So you look at all this, and then you look at the stuff that was being reported by Peter Zowski. Well, it was years later, and I forget what started this, but I went to PEI with David Savette, the diver, who has been involved and done UFO investigations. And for some reason, we decided we had time in our hands, and we jumped in his Jeep and we went over the Confederation Bridge and decided we're going to look into this case. And we went to Ebenezer, and we ended up staying overnight. I can remember at a friend of mine, Annette Toll, that used to run the Holiday Haven campground in Cornwall, right? And we went out the next day. I remember it was a rainy day, and we went everywhere in Ebenezer. We went up and down the main road and every side road and knocked on every door and spoke to someone. We went to the churches and spoke to clergy that had been there for some time. And nobody in Ebenezer knew of this. Nobody had heard of it or remembered it. And I remember at the end of the day, and the weather was miserable. It got to the point we'd pull up in David's Jeep, and Annette and David were inside, and I was the only one getting out that still had the impetus to go to the door and knock and ask. I was soaking wet. And the last house we went to was a place where, when the door opened, there was a wet dog there, and the people were very friendly, as they are here in the Maritimes, invited me in, and I tried to test their memory. They said they'd been lifelong residents, and they had no recollection whatsoever. And I was just about to leave, and I looked at the gentleman. His wife was laying on the sofa with a broken leg, and I said, was there anybody who used to live in the village, was a bit of a gossip or had something? And I can remember the husband looked at his wife and said, call Carol. And he made that call. And of course, this woman was like, oh, yeah, that was so-and-so and so-and-so. They were renting the captain's house. They're in Charlottetown now and blah, blah. And it all kind of connected. Well, basically what we learned is there seemed to be a case, as was suggested basically in the RCC report, that there had been a landing, that people had reported that the Mounties couldn't find it and whatever. But all these lurid details of Men in Black and Pontiac 6000s and government investigations could only be sourced to the Peter Zowski show. So I got Annette to look into that, and what we eventually discovered was that there was a young intern working at the show that was doing that for a summer job that eventually went into law. And she was the source of all this stuff, and she felt pressured and added all these details when she looked at the literature and thought this is what was expected.
Oh, so she went into law. That's not a big surprise.
Yeah, well, no names here anyway. But she had regretted it, and all those lower details were added on because she thought this was job, and she couldn't believe her story was getting national attention. And it wasn't that she wanted to fan the flame, but you could understand that was the motivation with her. At the end of the day,
correct? I'm sorry, Chris. This was just
yeah,
set the
1990, I believe. In fact,
okay.
Yeah,
all right.
1990, and whenever the Crusades are, that's what, August, Steve. I think late August every year. Yeah.
12. 13,
anyway.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, there's still a UFO story here. There's still a report, but not nearly the amount of detail. But, it's interesting to show, again, a big theme with me, how persistence pays off, knocking on doors, getting out of the armchair. And when you get to the truth, but at the end of the day, what you got is real, and there's still a mystery there. Not quite as big as what we'd hoped for, not quite worthy maybe of the Peter Zowski show, but it'll remain a mystery in the UFO case. And there you go. But, Steve, never cancel a sky watch again. Who knows? It's the one that got away. Like Shag
Haven't
Harbor.
seen a bull lights then. Haven't seen a bull lights then.
We're getting the musical hook here.
We're in wrap up mode here.
I'll drink.
Fascinating, Steve. Thanks very much for coming on the show and giving us those wonderful little stories and tidbits.
Thanks for having me. Great fun.
Yeah, we'd like to have you back. You get a new. You're still active, correct?
Yes. Doing cougar sightings now.
Oh God, we got to tell that next time. Remember,
cougar sightings. Cougar
in Shag Harbor.
I've seen one.
That is interesting.
So.
Wow. Well, listen.
No cougars in Nova Scotia, but hundreds of people see them.
That's amazing. Well, thanks very much for being on the show, Chris or Steve. And Chris, any last words?
Keep looking up. You just never know. And Steve, we'll do this again. That's it.
Yes.
Great stuff.
Yeah. Hope to see you soon, Michael, in person.
Thank you very much. You too.
Yeah.
We'll see you.
Goodbye, everybody, and thanks our guests for watching the show. And we'll see you next time on FSUFO.